So in the following presentation, we're going to focus on the idea of idealism and education. And the goal here is to look at idealism as a philosophy and certainly as it applies to education. But what our group's aim here is that hopefully we get a better understanding of idealism and more specifically how idealism's playing out in high schools today, also in some middle schools, and in the private sector, in private schools, because I think it kind of differs, but at the same time we would all agree that idealism is still alive in education today. So when we think about idealism, we can start by looking at the overall idea of idealism in education. So we're going to talk a little bit about how idealism is very encouraging and the fact that it encourages students to focus on things with lasting value. Now, with that in mind, we can actually move on to look at the idealistic notion of the relationship from part to whole, or a symbolic relationship of the self to the society. We can look at this in terms of some strengths, and you can see that on page 22 in the textbook it's outlined a little bit here about these strengths when we talk about schools, especially when we talk about math. And Plato talked about this a lot, that in mathematics we can see these absolute truths. 2 plus 2 is 4, etc. But what this does is it reminds students that we have some real-world implications and some concepts that are appropriate and fitting for life. And I think that's really important when we talk about idealism, specifically in education. We can also look at some societal problems as well as we're searching in idealism for these truths, because not everything in society is just this basic 2 plus 2 equals 4 notion, as sometimes I think we wish it would be. So actually when we move on and look at the next slide, you can actually see specifically where Mesquite ISD has a course set up that specifically is geared to kind of this concept of idealism in the broader picture. When we look at this class or this course, it's actually a social studies class or a history class, and it's looking at society and some of the specifics in the social studies context. Now, why this class is important is because it focuses on like government and human rights, and it really ties back into idealism because those things flow completely with idealism in the sense that it has this connection from the self to society. This idealistic notion that we are a part of the whole, if you will. And I think that's really important to remember, especially when we're looking at idealism with regards to education in our classrooms today. And so that's one example of a course out there right now at the secondary level in high schools in Mesquite ISD that's available for students and how it ties back to idealism. But now we can go on to look at how idealistic philosophies, they promote cultural traditions. Kind of what we mean by this is when we look at idealism as a philosophy, it will promote culture, and there's some strengths behind that. For example, schools have incorporated rubrics and teacher rubrics and critical thinking and cognition, which ultimately promotes this idea of culture and sharing and tradition. But one of the problems with this, however, is that teachers might unwillingly use their own life examples and their own perceptions rather than looking at this through the eyes of the student. So when we talk about idealism that promotes culture and traditions, I think that's good, but the drawback to this is, are you looking at this idealism and this type of thing through your lens or through the student's lens? And I think that's really important. Page 27 in the text kind of refers to that. But not only do we have to look at these cultures and traditions, but we can give another relevant example on this slide about a middle school social studies course that talks about human rights and how that's important. And when we look at the idea again of idealism, I want to tie this back and keep the focus here on idealism in education today. And what's great is that there's a lot of courses out there for students that tie into the idealistic philosophy and this whole idealism as we are a part of the greater society and that we continue to search for truth. And we've talked a lot, not only in the course, but in the textbook, about how when we're searching for truth and we try to discover it, that these notions are really relevant in society today, especially when we look at the outline of this middle school course and specifically what the middle school's social studies course on human rights is trying to promote. So we can see that when we're looking at human rights, we tie that right back into the idealism philosophy and how that all kind of ties back together with this holistic to part and continuing to search for the truth. Now, when we look at the next slide, we can look at idealism in education and specifically views that teachers, as a revered person or someone who's seen as being a good person or we're revered as educators. The problem, however, that we can look to when we talk about this is there's a weakness in this, in that, and page 28 kind of suggests this in the textbook, that teachers expect to be respected rather than being assistants in learning. So when we talk about idealism, if we're going to go with the whole philosophy that Plato has set up and that all these, Aristotle and other people have said that, we're searching for the truth, well, then it's our job as educators not to be the front runner in the room and demand respect, but we have to guide students along. We can't just simply demand respect and hope that it shows up. Now, this could be kind of contrary and gets a little bit tricky when you go into the private sector. And so that's the next slide you're looking at, is actually at Dallas Christian Prep School. You can see that they have courses specifically, as you could probably imagine, that are focused and centered around Christianity and faith and how all of that kind of plays together. Not that this is a bad thing by any means. I mean, we've talked in class, and the textbook would even tell you that deities and the supernatural and whatever your faith might be is what many people believe to be the absolute truth, right? So why not teach it? The problem, though, is when we tie this back into the previous slide, is the Bible teaches, especially students, and when we're looking at just Christian principles, that there's an authority figure, and that I'm there to be the authority figure, and so that could cause some contrast when we talk about idealism. So maybe there's not as much dialogue happening when we're focused primarily on these religious factors, and maybe in these private schools, one of the drawbacks could be that we might not see as much partners in learning, although that's also a drawback in public schools, so we just can't fault one specific class or anything to that nature. Moving to the next slide, though, we can see idealism has a conservative nature. What we mean by that in a conservative nature is that when we improve on curriculum planning, for example, teachers tell students information which is most often taken as fact, and then students later learn that information is not quite correct or may have some false logic. We can improve in this, and it's very conservative, and the argument here is that idealism promotes these kind of old school truths sometimes, and the weakness there is that we're not evolving. You can go to page 28 and 29, and it says that developing their own metacognition and intrinsic motivation at an early age for later development, where they'll question everything. This is kind of really what our goal should be as educators. So if we kind of stay in this conservative nature of idealism, the weakness here is that teachers might approach ideas with just absolute truths, and again, not focus as much as we might want them to on this holistic nature and this discovery of truth. Now, the next slide you're looking at is idealist curriculum and how it can be overly bookish or curriculum, textbook heavy, and intellectual. The weakness here, as page 31 would suggest, is that the viewpoint doesn't focus on students' emotional, physical, and social needs and the whole cognitive process. Sociology would tell you, I mean, regardless of the philosophy, that if we just look at idealism with regards to curriculum, that we need to be discovering and looking and searching for truth, that may get to, in education at least, textbook-centered. And that might not be the best approach, because that kind of takes away some of the dialogue and the engaging material and the things that Plato wanted us to do in order to search for the truth. So we can see this could absolutely be a hindrance when we talk about curriculum and idealism, because it very well may set some students back because the dialect isn't happening. So to kind of recap what we've looked at today in the presentation, it's the idea that idealism is still alive and well in education. It's got some really great strengths,